Keedysville, Maryland. It's at a regional research and education center. One of the things we do there is we do goats. Every summer, beginning of June, we begin a meat goat performance test. We bring in bucks, and we're trying to find genetically superior bucks, particularly with regards to parasite resistance and resilience. We've also been doing a study comparing pen-fed versus pasture-fed goats. Answering questions in the chat box will be Jeff Semler. Jeff gave the presentation last week. Jeff is a county extension agent in this county where our research center is located, here in Washington County. Jeff and I were talking about this yesterday. What we're gonna let the person in the chat box answer the questions, and because sometimes when you're making the presentation, you kind of disrupt your presentation if you start looking at the chat box. So I'm going to let Jeff handle the questions in the chat box, and then when the presentation's over, then I'll go back to fielding some questions in the chat box. So again, this is our third presentation, third part of the series on selection. The first one we covered kind of the basics of genetics. Jeff talked about breeding systems, so today we're going to talk about selection. There's basically two ways to make genetic improvement in a sheep farm or a goat farm. The first one's crossbreeding, and Jeff covered that last week in his session on breeding systems. Of course, there are different breeding systems. Crossbreeding is when we breed two animals that are of a different breed or type. And what we find with crossbreeding is we get a phenomenon called heterosis or hybrid vigor, which is basically the superiority of the crossbred offspring, compared to the average of the two parent breeds. So for example, if you crossed a Suffolk ram with a Katahdin ewe, the crossbred lamb wouldn't grow faster than a purebred Suffolk ram. The idea is that he would be superior to the average of those two parent breeds. The traits that respond well to crossbreeding generally do not respond well to selection. Perfect example is when we talked about introducing the Finn breed of sheep in the chat box. We talked about that about 15 minutes ago. Reproductive rate does not respond well to selection, but it responds extremely well to crossbreeding. Not so much in that case heterosis, but more combining the breeds. But things like survival and things like that respond very well to crossbreeding. Selection is the other method to make improvement. Crossbreeding, you get an impact immediately. 5 months later, as soon as you make that decision, put the two different breeds together, 5 months later you get lambs. Selection is a long-term commitment. There's very few things that you can select for and see much progress in 1 year. And just like, as I said, crossbreeding, the traits that respond well to crossbreeding don't respond well to selection. The traits that respond well to selection don't respond well to crossbreeding. Again, if you look at the pictures, that's a boar Nubian doe, so a crossbred doe with crossbred kids. And we get a lot of hybrid vigor for things like fertility, survival, things like that. Conversely, if I'm trying to get a bigger ribeye in a lamb or a goat, I can get it through crossbreeding in the sense of combining a heavy muscle breed with a light muscle breed, but I don't get any hybrid vigor. Simply by crossing does not make the ribeye bigger. Okay? So different traits, different methods of improvement work well. Okay, so what is selection? Selection basically is you're choosing which of the animals on your farm get to be a parent. Or if you're going out and picking out a new buck or new ram from somebody's flock, you're choosing which one gets to be a parent. And then you're choosing which male goes with which female. Basically, you're putting the breeding pairs together. You're making the choice. There's two types of selection, natural selection and artificial. We can think of natural selection as survival of the fittest. The picture of those soy sheep, it's an island in Scotland where these sheep live. And so while we do raise this breed of sheep, we raise them in the United States, we do breed them, there's still some feral soy sheep in Scotland. They've been recently doing a lot of research with them to see how certain traits change because, again, it's natural selection. They're responding to their environment. Basically a survival of the fittest. And we've got a number of breeds that evolved that way. Our most parasite-resistant breed, or one of our most parasite-resistant breeds in the United States, is one called the Florida or Gulf Coast Native. Basically, the assumption is that this breed became parasite-resistant because that was the only way it was going to survive the tough, humid climate of Florida, Louisiana, in that Gulf Coast area, so kind of a survival of the fittest. Maybe the same can be said of the Spanish goat or the Tennessee fainting goat. Initially, not a lot of selection was applied to those animals, and over time they become extremely adaptable to the environment. But that's not the typical way we make breeds. That's not the typical way we try to make improvements. Artificial selection, obviously, is we're trying to make decisions determining what type of traits that plants or animals have. So we're intervening in selection. Probably the breed that has the most years or centuries of selection would be the Merino, which is shown in the other picture. We've been selecting Merinos for a very, very long time. They have probably the longest heritage. And keep in mind, originally sheep didn't have wool, so selection goes back many, many, many centuries. So many, many, many centuries of artificial selection have created the Merino and have continued to improve the Merino and have continued to make it the very best wool sheep in the world. So what is our goal of selection? Basically, in selection, we're just simply trying to increase the frequency of desirable alleles and reduce the frequency of undesirable alleles. In some cases, there's some traits or genes that we want to get rid of. If we have think of a serious defect, spider lamb disease in Suffolk sheep, we'd actually like to get rid of that gene in the flock. Some people want to get rid of the Q gene, which is the susceptible gene for scrapie in their flock. So there's some cases we want to get rid of those genes, but mostly we're just trying to get more of the better traits or the better alleles and less of the other ones. If you think back to our earlier presentations, if you think back to what is inbreeding, inbreeding is trying to kind of standardize the alleles to get more of the same. Not necessarily better ones, it could be better ones or it could be worse ones, but it's getting the same ones. Here we're trying to specifically say we're trying to select to get the most desirable ones and to reduce the frequency of the undesirable. Because genetics is a crapshoot. If you remember from the first presentation, the huge numbers of combinations of genetics you could get just by breeding the same male to the same female. It was like, I don't remember the exact number, but you're talking about millions of combinations of genetics. So as we select, we're just trying to get more of the better ones. And selection is very difficult. Most of the traits that we are interested in are quantitative traits or polygenic. That means they're controlled by many, many different genes. We talked about some of the traits that are affected by single genes. Eye color, whether or not a sheep has a fleece. Certain color, whether it has color or whether it doesn't have color. But that's not most of the traits we're interested in, and that's not most of the traits that are of economic significance. So we're working with traits that are controlled by many different genes. And what we see is not what we get. Phenotype is not the same as genotype. Because basically the equation is that phenotype, P, equals genotype plus the environment. So we can't see those genes in a lot of cases. In the case of what color it is or what color its eyes are or whether it has horns, yes, we can see those. But again, those are very few traits. A lot of times we're interested in things to do with fleece quality, rate of gain, how big the ribeye or loin eye area is. They're all quantitative traits that we can't simply see by looking at the animal. And it's always a challenge to separate genetics from environmental influence. And all of us fall into that trap. We go to a farm B has these nice big rams, and farm C, they're not as good. Well, the bigger ones on the first farm must be genetically superior when they're not necessarily. They could be, maybe not. We're not able to separate the environment. Other challenges is some traits we cannot directly select for or even easily select for. For example, you take one of the problems with reproductive rate is that, you know, she only has offspring once a year, maybe 3 times every 2 years or something like that. The trait's not repeated that much, you know, so it's very difficult to select for. And it can't be selected for very easily in the male. So some of them are harder to select for. And the important thing overall to remember is it's all about population genetics, what we call quantitative genetics. It's not necessarily about that individual animal. When we say a trait is 20% heritable, that doesn't mean this individual animal is 20% of the reason why he's a certain way. It's more, we apply a lot of that, the process is to large populations. And sometimes on small flocks, it sometimes gets a little bit confusing because we don't have a large enough numbers sometimes for those all the numbers kind of to work out. So we're going to go through what I call the selection basics in each of these aspects: heritability, repeatability, selection differential, generation interval, and then genetic progress. And go through what each of these means and look at a lot of different things and hopefully make it real world. I guess the most important concept we talk about is heritability, and that's usually abbreviated by H with a 2 superscript. And basically heritability is the proportion of the phenotypic variation in a population, not in an animal, but in a population that is due to genetics. And we express it as a percentage. So if I look at the trait of prolificacy or litter size, within a population, you know, a breed, a species, all the animals in a research project, in a record-keeping scheme, the heritability of litter size has averaged about 10%. So within that population, prolificacy is controlled 10% by genetics and influenced 90% by the environment. But it's a population thing. Okay, milk yield. And this could be sheep, or this could be goats, or it could be meat animals or dairy animals. But the heritability of milk production, just looking at the quantity, the pounds of milk, is about 30 to 35% heritable. So considerably higher than reproductive rate. As far as I know, the most heritable trait that I've seen data on is the length of the tail. I have seen estimates up to 82% heritable on tail length. And you say, well, why would we even know that? Well, there's been research done over the years, and especially here recently, to try to breed sheep that don't need docked. And while us sheep people often don't dock our lambs, and goat people don't need to worry about it, the wool people or wool breeds, we do need to dock them. And so the idea is would be to create an animal that didn't need docked. And so they've been actually doing breeding experiments. Years ago, the United States did some experiments trying to breed sheep without tails. And they were successful in doing it, but they found that as they selected for no tails, they found out it was kind of a lethal gene, because they had a lot of them died, kind of like the trait in the Manx cat. It was correlated with a lethal gene. Of course, the other traits that would be more highly heritable even than tail length would be things like having 4 legs and 2 ears and things like that. You know, we don't think of them as being controlled by genetics, but they are, and they're pretty much 100% heritable. A couple of things about heritability estimates, because we're going to talk a lot about heritability, and knowing what the heritability of a trait is very important in deciding whether you can have much success improving that trait in your flock or herd. And what I want you to understand is there's a lot of heritability estimates for sheep traits. You know, because there's so many sheep raised in places like Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, a lot of research has been done, a lot of heritabilities have been calculated. There are also a fairly decent amount of heritability estimates for dairy goats, both production and both milk type traits, but also conformation type traits and things like that. For traits that are subjectively measured, I had a really hard time finding much. There's some heritabilities for linear appraisal traits in dairy goats, certainly in dairy cattle and a little bit in beef cattle. But to find out how heritable length is in sheep or height is in sheep, it's hard to actually find some numbers. So a lot of the stuff that you look at when you're selecting, if you show livestock and you're looking for certain visual traits, it's pretty hard to find some actual numbers on that. The other thing I want you to keep in mind about heritabilities is they vary. You know, they're calculated from data, from a research project, from performance records, from DHIA records, from estimated breeding values. They're calculated, you know, with different species. They're calculated using different breeds. They're calculated when animals that are raised in different environments. So they can actually have a fairly wide range. So very often when we say, well, this trait is 10% heritable, we're taking an average. So the average heritability on that reproductive rate at 10%, there's probably at least 50 estimates for that. And probably some are above 10% and some are below 10%, but the average is used. For those of you who raise meat goats, unfortunately there aren't very many. In fact, I don't know if I'm going to give you any heritability estimates that are actually from meat goat populations. And the reason is because in this country it's still a very young industry, maybe about 20 years old. We're doing a lot of research, but heritability estimates take a lot of animals, and a lot of them come from performance record keeping programs, and we really don't have that in meat goats. So what we tend to use for meat goats is we tend to use the sheep data, because there's, you know, while there can be some differences, it's definitely in the ballpark and definitely in a good starting place. And the same thing can be true for looking at beef cattle traits on some of the traits that we look at in sheep. Like I mentioned, you can't find any heritabilities for something like height or length. Well, I don't see any reason why the beef cattle traits might not be pretty much in line. If I were to look at heritabilities in a very general sense and kind of lump them into trait categories, for the most part, as we've already said, the reproductive traits are very low heritability, 5 to 20%. And we're going to go through each of these trait groups and look at some specific traits to really give you some ideas of what traits you can, you know, have a good impact, how to attack a certain trait. Maybe you want more twins or triplets born, and maybe instead of selection, maybe you want to bring in a breed that's more prolific. So how do you improve a specific trait? It helps to know how heritable it is. So the reproductive traits are pretty lowly heritable. The growth traits kind of are more moderate. And when we use the terms low, moderate, and high, we usually think of up to 20% as being low, 20 to 40% as being moderate, and 40 to 60% as being high. So the growth traits are kind of in the middle. The carcass traits are also kind of in the middle. And by carcass traits, I mean things like percent retail cuts, ribeye area, leg circumference, fat in the carcass, dressing percent, things like that. Fleece traits are probably the highest heritable traits. And I'm talking sheep here. I don't really have any data. I don't know if anybody out there has cashmere or Angora goats, but most of the data that I have is on sheep, and some of the fleece traits are highly heritable. And of course, a lot of the research done with wool production, as I've indicated in previous meetings, is towards the commercial end, the commodity end, the fine white fleece. But again, I want you to keep in mind that the basics are the same regardless of whether we're producing a fine white wool for the commodity market or I'm trying to produce hand-spinning fleeces. The heritabilities are going to be similar, and the process that you would go about improving that trait would be quite similar. Lactation traits would also be moderately heritable, and here we're going to talk about milk production, components of milk production, but also some of the conformation traits that are important to the lactating female. So that's just in general, where these traits fall. And we're going to find exceptions. I mean, there's some, within the reproductive group, there's a trait that's much higher than 20% that we'll talk about a little bit. But generally speaking, this is kind of how they rank in terms of heritability. So we're going to start with reproductive rate. And there's a lot of different reproductive traits, and there's also reproductive traits that are specific to the male, of course most of them being specific to the female. And again, most of the traits have a very low heritability. Fertility is a perfect example, whether or not the female conceives and gets pregnant. That is very, very lowly heritable, 5%, even less than litter size. So basically what we're saying here is whether this female gets pregnant is pretty much all about your management and the environment. The heritability selecting for it isn't going to do much for it. So the important one is probably, for most of us, is that litter size, and that's only 10% heritable. I would still select for a trait that's 10% heritable, though, because it is the most important trait in raising, at least raising the meat animals, is the number born, which leads to number weaned, that sort of thing. One of the things that's very common to do, and we'll talk about this later, is if I look at the third trait down, ewe productivity, and it would be no different for doe productivity, that's 20% heritable. That's twice as heritable. And it's actually a composite trait because it brings in fertility, litter size, milk production. It's actually pounds of babies weaned. Okay? But you can just see some of the different traits. They're not, real highly heritable, but you do see some that are a little bit higher. I'm not sure where I got the estimate for mothering ability, and I'm not sure, sometimes I have to read the paper to see actually how they define mothering ability, because most of these estimates come from the Sheep Production Handbook and our long established heritability estimates. A couple, the one I mentioned that some of them are significantly higher, apparently gestation length is. I'm not sure. It's an economic trait. Do we really care if she's 142 days in gestation or 148 days? I'm not sure it has an economic place, but it is more heritable. Probably the most important trait that has a higher heritability in here is scrotal circumference of the ram. It's a fairly heritable trait. It's also a trait that's correlated to reproductive rate in the female. Besides scrotal size being important for the ram's fertility, research has shown in various species, including sheep, that rams with a larger scrotal size will sire daughters that have a higher ovulation rate. And of course, ovulation rate is an important component of prolificacy, number of lambs born, ewe productivity. The other one that I think is kind of interesting is longevity. That's a little bit more heritable. The longer a ewe or doe maintains herself in a flock can be an economic value. Spring fertility is not very highly heritable. By that I mean we know sheep are very seasonal, and so spring fertility was different, I guess, than out of season breeding, but just kind of gives you an idea how successful you'd be selecting for out of season breeding. Goats, I might think might be quite different because they tend to be, at least the meat goat breeds tend to be less seasonal than the sheep. So let's move on to the next group of traits, which will be our growth traits. Again, we classify these as moderately heritable traits, so typically above 20%. One thing you'll notice if you look at the heritabilities on weights, with the exception of birth weight, as we go from 60, 90, 120, 240 to mature weight, you find that the older the lamb gets, the more heritable growth is. In those younger ages, it's kind of a matter of getting away from the influence of the mom, because I'd say up to 60-day weight, most of that's going to be the milk production of the female. Again, these particular heritability estimates are for sheep. They're from the Sheep Production Handbook. For meat goats, we would use these same heritability estimates. Basically would be the same. So the bigger the animal gets, particularly if you start looking at how big your female is going to be or your male is going to be, mature weight is a very highly heritable trait. Feed efficiency would be how efficiently they convert feed, how many pounds of grain or ration they need to produce a pound of meat. Again, is a moderately heritable trait. But as the lambs get older and get away from the influence on the mother, they become more highly heritable traits. Our next group would be their carcass traits, and these are also classified as moderately heritable. Some of these traits come from the Sheep Production Handbook. Some of them came from a publication out of the University of Missouri. We probably have a lot more of this data on beef cattle. Again, for goats, we're going to have to basically make some assumptions that they're going to be quite similar until we get some estimates on that. So you can just kind of look in general. Dressing percent's not very heritable, 10%. And that's kind of logical because there's a lot of different factors that affect dressing percent. Dressing percent is the percent how much carcass you get relative to the live weight of the animal, and there's a lot of different factors that affect that. But as we get to kind of the end point, the traits towards the bottom, well, really most of them, you can just see they're pretty highly heritable. Loin eye area is about 35% heritable. In the U.S., we tend to look at the entire circumference of the ribeye or loin eye. Most other countries in the world are looking at the depth of the loin, but I saw a range of data on that. But these carcass traits are pretty highly heritable, so we can definitely, or pretty moderately heritable. We can make some good progress by selecting. If you raise a terminal sire breed, a Suffolk or something like that, you can make some real progress by selecting for ribeye area. You can have your animals scanned. You know, I mentioned that some traits aren't easily measured. Well, before we scanned for ribeye, that was a very difficult trait to measure because obviously the animal had to be slaughtered in order to get that data. And of course, some of these, they still do need to be harvested in order to get the data. But now with the advent of ultrasound, we really have excellent tools for selecting for animals with superior muscling in the ribeye area. Pretty decent heritability on percent retail cuts, weight of retail cuts. If you're a direct marketer, that's exactly what you're selling. That's the product that you're selling. So very important traits. Okay, what about fleece traits? Again, these are even more highly heritable. I want you to look in particular at staple length. Most of these estimates, not all of them, but most of them are from the Sheep Production Handbook. Staple length is the length of the fiber, the length of the, and typically a longer, all other things equal, a longer fiber, you're going to get more wool. Yield is also highly heritable. Clean fleece weight's about 25% heritable. Grease fleece weight about 35% heritable. So these are some pretty high numbers. So you can really make some impacts in selection. Well, I don't know how many people out there raise Rambouillet sheep or Merino sheep and are shooting for the commercial high-end fine wool market, but a lot of these traits, it's the same in all breeds, or at least you'd expect it to be, you know, in the ballpark. When you start thinking about hand spinning fleeces, things like crimp and color and character and handle, they are also important. Most of that data would have come out of Australia, again, mostly probably from merinos, but still. The coefficient of variation of fiber diameter, one of the most important things I teach kids when they're judging fleeces. I said it's not which one has the smallest or biggest fiber diameter, but we want uniformity. That's 50% heritable, very highly heritable trait. So you can make some real impact on fleece traits simply by selecting. Okay, what about lactation, milk production? And you can look at this from two standpoints. You can look at it from, well, if someone was a dairy producer, you know, what are the heritability of these traits? I like to look at it as a sheep producer in general, because I think one of the most important traits is milk production. More milk for those lambs and kids means they're going to grow faster. A higher fat percentage, protein percentage in that milk is also going to mean the same thing. So those things are important to me. The conformation traits on the udder are really practical traits and really important traits. The better udder conformation, less likely I am to have mastitis. The teat placement, as far as you know, desirable teat placement and size for the kids and lambs to suckle, you know, all of those things are important to me. And so those are some actual conformation traits that are subjectively evaluated. They're not quite as heritable as the actual milk production, the components, but still you can make some pretty good progress on milk production. And for most of us, if we're a dairy producer, they would select directly on, they'd have data, and this is the same as true with dairy goats, you're going to actually select on milk, you know, pounds of milk produced. From the meat producer standpoint, that productivity index or weaning weight, that's going to also be an indication of milk production. I tried to find estimates on number of teats and teat defects, and I wasn't able to find any data whatsoever. Although I have one at the end that I want to talk a little bit about in terms of teats. Finally, we have some data that's very specific to goats and really fresh off the press. Fresh off the press. This was a paper that came out in the Journal of Dairy Science just the end of last year, and they looked at the DHIA records for all six of the main dairy goat breeds. And they not only, they calculated heritabilities, they also looked at how things had changed over time, and they also made some breed comparisons. I think someone in an earlier question had asked, is there any information on breed? Well, dairy goats, there definitely is. I mean, not only through a paper like this, but the American Dairy Goat Association is able to provide breed differences. We can only do it in dairy goats, and the reason we can only do it in dairy goats is because that is the only component really of the small ruminant industry in the United States that has performance record keeping. You know, it may not be huge numbers of goats and huge numbers in every breed, but they have representation of every breed, and they have data so they can actually say what these breeds are. We have some of that data for some of the sheep breeds, and we'll talk about most of that stuff in the next week. But until you have objective data, things like EPDs and things like that, you cannot say, well, here's what the breeds are. It's all speculation. But this particular paper definitely compares the breeds of dairy goats. And as you can see, the heritabilities for these milk production, maybe even a little bit higher than they are on sheep. You know, you look at protein percentage, that's over 15%, fat percentage is over 15%. So milk production is a highly is a heritable trait. You can definitely make progress on these traits. So this is legitimately some good dairy goat data, and it has been published before, but this is the very most recent data that we have. I wish we could have wish I could see the same thing for meat goats. I think the sheep data is pretty good. I mean, we've had a lot of work that's been done, and we can feel pretty confident on those numbers as well. What we really lack is some of the meat goat data. This is traits to me that are becoming of greater significance, and I think in our final session when we talk about some of the more advanced aspects of making genetic improvement and some of what I think of as some of the futuristic things that might be available to us, I think diseases are a huge part of that. And disease resistance, we're particularly focusing in on that in terms of parasites. As I mentioned in our buck test, that's our primary interest. We're trying to identify bucks that are genetically more resistant and resilient to internal parasites. I'm involved in another study with foot rot, looking to see if we can find the genes or a genetic marker for foot rot resistance. A lot of work's been done in New Zealand on foot rot resistance. So these are just a few of the traits that there is some figures for. DAG scores is just how kind of like a poopy butt, how messy the rear gets, often a sign of parasites, gives you what that heritability is. Parasite resistance is thought to be about 25% heritable. You see I have 50% there. In a breed that already has some resistance like the Katahdin, there's actually data that shows that they are that you can make more rapid progress on a breed that's already has some resistance. Fly strike, pretty important in those wool producing countries. They've calculated a heritability for that. Same thing with foot rot. And mostly here I mean resistance to these diseases. When I say parasite resistance, we evaluate that with fecal egg counts, because if you remember, I said some traits are hard to measure. Well, the only way to accurately measure parasite resistance is to kill the animal and count the number of worms in their abomasum and intestines. So obviously we can't do that. We use a correlated trait, which is fecal egg counts. So somebody asked a question, I think I caught out of the corner of my eye, the difference between parasite resistance and resilience. Resistance is when you basically resist getting sick. They prevent the worms from getting established. So less worms get established, there's less eggs. Resilience, which is of a fairly low heritability, it's a much more complex trait. In the barber pole worm, which is the predominant parasite, the blood-sucking parasite, we measure that with packed cell volume, which is the proportion of red blood cells in the blood. So an animal that's resilient, no matter how many worms he's got in his gut or how many eggs in his fecal, he stays healthy and he produces and he keeps a high packed cell volume. If you do FAMACHA scores, he keeps a good FAMACHA score. FAMACHA scores are correlated to packed cell volume. So a 1 FAMACHA score relates to a certain packed cell volume. So it's about 10% heritable. It's one of the reasons it's less heritable is it's a less variable trait. It's a most of us, if we do FAMACHA scores and not packed cell volume, it's a more subjective trait, and there's a lot more genes probably that affect it. Somatic cell count would be has a strong correlation to mastitis, and there you can see what the heritability of that is. So if you look at some of the major diseases that we have in the sheep and goat business, foot rot, parasites, and mastitis, I would consider those the three most important diseases from a productivity standpoint in the sheep and goat industry, and we do have some data and we are making some effort towards using genetics to hopefully reduce these problems. The last thing I went looking for is to try to find some heritabilities on what we would consider genetic defects, because some of those, a lot of these you'd like to get rid of, but they're not controlled by a single gene. Again, there's very few, and I keep throwing out spider lamb disease as being a classic example. That's a simple disease inheritance. The affected lamb gets a recessive gene from each of its parent. It's easy to get rid of. These other ones are not controlled by single genes. Cryptorchidism, which is basically when one or two of the testicles fails to descend in the scrotum. I couldn't find a figure on it. If you read stuff, it's presumed to be of high heritability, but not a single gene because there is an environmental effect. Entropion, which is an inverted eyelid, if you read things about genetic defects, it will tell you that it's highly heritable. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think 15% is highly heritable. I'm not saying you shouldn't select against inverted eyelids at all, but the only research paper that I'm aware of was done with 6 different breeds of sheep, and they showed that it's only 15% heritable. So again, it's got multiple genes and it has an environmental impact. Probably the most heritable trait in here, at least having a number, is face cover, and this relates, if you wonder, well, why is that important? We used to have a real problem with sheep having too much wool on their face, and we called it wool blindness, so that is a very highly heritable trait. I really scoured the internet trying to find any kind of data on multiple nipples or teat defects. Yes, somatic cell counts are higher in small ruminants than they are in cows. One of the more interesting stories goes back to Alexander Graham Bell. He actually selected sheep with multiple nipples, believing they would give birth to more offspring. He eventually gave up on the research and it didn't pan out, but I've never been able to find an estimate on multiple nipples. I know the meat goats, the boar goats, have a lot of teat defects, fish teats, cluster teats, things like that, and I just couldn't find any information to see what the heritability, just again the presumption that perhaps it's fairly highly heritable. I don't know. Jaw position, and what I mean by that is overbites, underbites. Again, you read most things and they'll say, well, those are highly heritable and you should get rid of everything. 13% doesn't really seem that high to me, but there may be some other figures. Hernias, and there's various different types of hernia. Again, the heritability is presumed to be high. I couldn't find it, but just keep in mind they're not just a simple recessive trait from each parent, but there are multiple genes that are controlling it. Rectal prolapse. Fair number of studies has looked at this. About 14% of the variation is due to genetics. So that means there's an awful lot of environmental influence on why a lamb will prolapse its rectum. Vaginal prolapse, same kind of thing. You know, you're said, well, if a female has a vaginal prolapse where you should get rid of her and all of her offspring. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm not saying you should. Its heritability, I would suspect, is probably similar to a rectal. It's probably definitely has a genetic component, but probably isn't as it's not, again, it's not a simple inheritance. It has a very, very large environmental impact. I mean, I could list 10 contributing factors to prolapses without any difficulty. And when there's that many environmental influences, you know the heritability is low. But nonetheless, there's genetic components to all of these diseases. And if these diseases are a major problem for you, even if the heritability is low, it's something that you ought to focus on. What about conformation and type? Because I know a lot of folks raise animals to show, and also it's important to them what the animals look like. And I know the dairy goats put an emphasis on some of the linear appraisal traits. And on the dairy goats, there are heritability estimates. I just didn't include them in the slideshow. If I look at the conformation and type on, say, the meat animals or the fiber animals, there's not a lot, again, there's not a lot of data that I can find. When they combine the conformation traits, like call something like type or size, the heritabilities are really low because they include a lot of different traits. But probably when it's fairly singular, like height or length, most geneticists would say, they're highly heritable. And they say, oh, well, all you ought to really do is look at the show ring or look at your own experiences. You bring in a big tall ram and breed them to your ewes, and you get a lot of tall lambs. So obviously they must be highly heritable. What's more important, not to people who show animals, but for people who raise animals for production, is these traits, while they're highly heritable, they probably aren't well correlated with performance. So you got to think of, well, why am I breeding these animals to decide how important these traits are? If you're showing your animals, and that's a very important aspect of our industries, you can make good progress on these traits. However, you still need to be concerned about how they might be correlated with performance at the same time, I think. Even though your emphasis is on how the animal looks, you still want to be concerned about how they might, what other unintended consequences you might get. The next, I spent a long time on heritability. The next component that's really important when we talk about trying to make genetic progress is what we call repeatability. And that's basically, well, if I take a fecal egg count on this buck today, and then I take one in 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, how related are those data going to be? She has twins this year, and what's she going to have next year? And it basically represents the upper level or the upper potential of heritability. And usually traits that are highly heritable have a high repeatability, and then just the opposite. But this is kind of just another concept that kind of muddies the water about genetic selection, repeatability. Okay, this buck was born a triplet. How repeatable, how repeatable is that data? Okay, the other thing that's important is the generation interval. Basically the average age of the parents when the progeny are born. And here I've got an extreme. I've got a yearling ewe that's got a set of twins, and I got an 11-year-old Katahdin ewe that has a set of twins. If I want to make more rapid genetic progress, I want to shrink that generation interval. So I don't want that 11-year-old ewe. I want that yearling. So I want to turn the flock over. I will make more genetic progress. Now, I'm not saying you should get rid of older ewes or older does that are productive, but understand that it limits the opportunity to make genetic progress. Somebody asked how long are ewes and does productive? They can be productive when they're 11 years old. But the problem is, if I don't replace her with somebody younger, I just can't keep growing my flock. I got to be able to and the same thing with males. I don't want to. If I want to make genetic progress, I'm going to use young males, and I'm going to keep using males. The best genetics in my flock should be the young ones. Typically, it averages about 4 in ewes and does. I can't really speak for what it might average in dairy. I suspect in a commercial dairy situation it would be less than 4 years of age. It's also going to vary by gender. You're going to turn the males over quicker then you're going to turn the females over. And then we have what's called the selection differential, and that's basically the difference between the animals that you select and what the average is in that population. If you have a small flock, it's really hard to make much genetic progress basically because of the math. But if you looked at our buck test, I use this as an example. The one thing I will say is I use an example of fecal egg counts. Fecal egg counts don't usually fit a bell curve. But just for the sake of explaining selection differential, let's say they fit a bell curve. And let's say on that particular data collection, the average fecal egg count was 1,500 eggs per gram. I had bucks as high as 10,000. I had them as low as 0. I'm going to select a few bucks for breeding or does for breeding that instead of averaging 1,500, they average 500. So my selection interval or differential is 1,000 eggs per gram. So if I were to calculate genetic progress, and keep in mind this is an incredibly simplistic example because it doesn't actually include repeatability. It's assuming that that is repeatable. But genetic progress, the way we would calculate that mathematically would be the heritability, which for some reason I use 40% in this example, times the selection differential, which was that 1,500 minus the 500, which would actually be 1,000 eggs per gram. So that 40% of 1,000 would be 400 eggs per gram divided by a generation interval of 4 would mean the progress that I would expect per year would be 100 eggs per gram. Again, you don't look at selection progress in 1 year. Selection is a commitment over time. And of course, the less heritable the trait is, the more investment in time you have. But if you start looking at 5 years, well, that's 500 eggs per gram. 10 years is 1,000 eggs per gram. In a long-term study in Australia with merinos, they were selecting to reduce the fecal egg count. And they actually didn't find that they made significant progress until they were about 8 years into the selection. Because again, we've got other factors that affect the progress we're going to make. But this gives you a general idea of how you would make, looking at it from a mathematical standpoint, how you would make genetic progress. And of course, genetic progress is going to be more rapid when it's a more heritable trait. So if I look at parasite resistance, I can make some progress because it's a more heritable trait than reproductive rate. And then again, the repeatability of that trait, if that's high, I'm going to make more progress. If there's a bigger difference between my selected individuals and the average of that population, I'm going to make a difference. Having a shorter generation interval will also accelerate progress, although as we shorten that interval, there's going to be a trade-off in that the difference between our average and our selected is probably going to get smaller. That was the basic concepts of what selection is. Now I want to talk about some of the practical aspects of selection. And this slide right here is basically what we're going to talk about next week. But you can't do selection without animal identification. It needs to be permanent. It needs to be unique. And you need to collect data. And you need to decide what data you're going to collect based on the purpose of your enterprise, based on the breed. The data that I would collect if I was a Suffolk breeder might be significantly different than the data I collect if I'm a Katahdin breeder, at least the emphasis I put on different traits. And then we got to have a method to keep those records and analyze those records. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about next week. And there's different ways to select. And you can think about how you may already do it. Individual selection would simply be selecting on the merit of that one individual. Our buck test is individual selection. Somebody comes to buy a buck. The only thing they have is what that buck looks like, and more importantly, all of that data on that individual buck. But it does not consider his family, it does not consider his pedigree. Possibly on your farm, when you look to keep an animal, you not only look at that individual animal, but you may consider the pedigree, the family, and how productive or how they've done for you. Progeny, that gets a little bit harder on a small farm. Some countries will do progeny testing because what's better than the record of the individual would actually be the record of the progeny. And then being able to combine kind of all of this, the family, the progeny, This is where we start looking at EPDs, EBVs, NPPAs, again, things we're going to talk about next week. We're combining the data from relatives. It's increasing the accuracy or repeatability of that data because we're bringing in a lot more data. So these are kind of the different ways that we can do it. Okay, now talk about methods of selection. First is single trait versus multiple trait. Basically, single trait we don't recommend. I think Jeff gave you a good example of what the dairy industry has done over the years. They've been incredibly successful selecting for single trait milk production. But what have the consequences been? I can relate a sheep example. One of the breeds of sheep that we have a lot of EPDs on is the Targhee breed. It's a dual-purpose breed, a lot of data on it. So what they found is for each 1 pound increase in weaning weight, which probably for their data would have been a 120-day weight, they got a 2.5 pound increase in ewe mature body size. So if you were simply selecting for weaning weight, you're going to get bigger sheep. And more than likely, that is not what you want. They found that the top rams, EPDs in weaning weight, were also the top rams in terms of ewe mature body size. So it's a kind of a good example of why you don't want to select for a single trait. And it makes sense, because if you're raising sheep or goats, and I don't care why you're raising them, your success is going to depend on the important or the improvement of more than one trait. You know, you just don't want the biggest sheep, or you just don't want the most prolific sheep. You know, you want different traits. You just don't want lots of milk. You also be concerned about the components of the milk. When you select for a single trait, you can get unexpected and undesirable consequences due to genetic correlations or environmental responses. Another good example was the beef industry. They selected for yearling weight. They got an increase in calf or birth weight, which led to calving problems. So we want to select for multiple traits. So how can we go about selecting for multiple traits? And there's basically 3 different ways. One, and I'll go through each of these, what we call tandem selection, independent culling rates, and a selection index. What I mean by tandem selection is when we focus on one trait. I want to improve reproductive rate. Well, actually, that won't take a very, very long time. I want to improve ribeye area. And so I focus on this trait until I achieve the level of performance that I'm looking for, and then I move on to the next trait, etc. This is, at least part of it is similar to single trait selection. The portion of the time that you're selecting for an individual trait, you may get changes, either positive or negative, to a correlated trait. Again, if I select for milk yield only as part of a tandem selection program, I'm going to reduce fat and protein percentage usually. If I select to increase staple length, on the other hand, I'm going to get more fleece weight, which might be a good thing. So just keep in mind you could get something you wanted or something you don't as you focus on a single trait at a time. The next way to select for multiple traits is basically independent culling levels. And what we mean by that is we select for 2 or more traits at one time, but we establish a minimum standard for each trait. Okay, so I'm not just going to focus on one thing, but I'm going to make sure they meet standards. And a good example of this is our buck performance test. We don't rank the bucks. We establish standards, we call them gold, silver, and bronze, for each of our 3 traits: parasite resistance, which is fecal egg counts; parasite resilience, which is FAMACHA scores and number of dewormings; and then growth rate, or average daily gain. So they have to, in order to make our sale and to be eligible to sell as a breeding buck, they have to meet each of those, basically their minimum standards, but we have 3 levels of minimum standards. Okay? So we're not just saying, well, the buck that grows the fastest, you know, we're not going to sell him if he's not sufficiently high in his other traits. And then we also, the other thing I didn't write up here, but we also have some minimum standards for the reproductive and structural kind of soundness and correctness. So if, I remember one year we had a buck that excelled in parasite resistance, parasite resilience, he excelled in growth rate, but he had horrible hooves, very abnormal hooves. So he didn't meet that minimum standard, so we got rid of him. So how might you do this on the farm? You might already be doing it. You might say, well, I'm going to keep the fastest growing buck, but I'm only going to keep him if he was at least a twin. Or I'm going to keep the fastest growing buck, but I'm not going to keep any goat that needs dewormed more than once or needs dewormed at all. So, or I'm not going to keep, typically most of us establish a minimum standard for structure. We're not going to keep, even if they're really good from a performance standpoint, we're not going to keep them if they've got some severe genetic or severe structural defects. So a lot of times you may not think you're doing this independent culling levels, but you are. I know, for example, in my flock, I try to keep the highest adjusted weaning weight, but then I only want to select a female that comes from a mother that has a good udder, because that subjective trait is important to me. The last thing, and we're winding down here, the last couple of slides, is what we would call a selection index. And basically what we're doing is we're trying to combine traits to determine the overall merit of an animal. A lot of performance, well, I'll get into that in the next slide. There's different ways to combine traits. What you see there on the right is some work done at Montana State University is kind of where the Targhee breed, one of the leaders in the Targhee breed, and the state is one of the leaders in the Targhee breed. And they were looking at the traits that are important to the Targhee breed, and they were weighing their importance. And that's basically the relative weight. So what they were saying here is that the weaning weight was the most important. And they're looking, in this case, they're looking from a profitability standpoint, not even just a genetic standpoint. And then lamb crop was also very important, and yearling weight wasn't very important. And so there's different ways that we use selection indexes. We can do them on a farm, kind of an on-farm index, central performance test, using EPDs, and in this case at Montana State University using profitability. And this next slide is going to seem fairly complicated, but it gives an example of what I mean by a selection index. I use the top one on my farm, and it's a simple productivity index, and it's basically, if you remember back to the heritabilities on reproductive traits, it's basically that ewe or doe productivity, pounds of quality lamb or kid weaned. And so that could be, and weaned could be 60 days for you, it could be 90 days, it could be 120 days. But this is a selection index because it combines all those traits. It combines fertility, whether or not she gets pregnant. It includes litter size. It includes mothering ability. It includes the survival of the offspring, and it includes her milk production. So to me, it's selecting for all those traits at once versus if I just selected for reproductive rate or I just selected for weaning weight. It's combining those. This obviously would be a trait looking at the dam itself. An old-time productivity index, and this was essentially based on profitability, was to take the pounds of lamb, basically that the ewe weaned, and add it to 2 times the weight of the fleece. And this was back when wool was worth 2 times the value of lamb. Now lamb is worth more than wool from a commodity standpoint. Now if I'm a fleece producer, if I sell fleeces to hand spinners, and then I also sell my lambs at the farmer's market or for freezer trade, I could still come up with an index like that. And I would base it on what I sell my lamb for and how do my fleece prices compare. So if my fleece price, if I sold lambs for $2 a pound and I could get $5 a pound for fleeces, I could come up with an index like that. And that would be, it's not really a productivity index as much as a profitability index. Some of the buck performance tests or ram performance tests will make indexes out of the data that they collect. And this is just an example of what they use at Pennsylvania. I believe they use it for rams and bucks. But they basically say that they're gonna determine the merit of a male by saying 40% of his average daily gain, 20% of his weight per day of age, 20% of his loin-eye area, and they'll adjust the loin-eye area for an equivalent metabolic weight. Because you got to keep in mind, the bigger an animal is, the bigger his ribeye is. So we want to make sure it's a fair comparison. And then 20% of his leg circumference also adjusted for the same metabolic weight. I know they do that for the bucks. They do an index for the rams. It might be the same or it might be different. That's basically, so if this is an index that you think, this kind of makes sense to you, these are how you would weight the traits, then you could look at which ones were the top indexing and you could value them accordingly. The two at the bottom look a lot more complicated. They're indexes based on that last slide, work that Montana State University had been doing with Targhee breed. They made an index, and again, it's profitability. How important were those traits? How important are those individual traits to the profitability of sheep production with the Targhee breed? They did one for a farm flock, and that's basically a range flock out on the range. You see the sheep a lot less, more emphasis on wool. Farm flock, more emphasis on meat, higher, more feed, more management, that sort of thing. And so these were the indexes they came up with. And weaning weight, maternal milk, which is an EPD trait, yearling weight, fleece weight, fiber diameter, and then lamb crop would be percentage, how many babies they gave birth to. And so you can see that there were some differences between the farm flock and the range flock, the fleece traits being more important to the range flock, and that sort of thing. And so they created an index. So that's what I mean by indexes. And they allow us to combine traits instead of just looking at a single trait or looking at multiple traits in individual ways. They're a way of ranking. I rank my mothers for pounds of quality lamb weaned. And so when I select an offspring, it has to come from a dam that ranks high in that. Can't be a single lamb, that sort of thing. So that's what I mean by, that's what these productivity indexes are, or all these indexes. And so what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about, how you work with your own animals to collect data. And I say performance, but we're also going to talk about some of the visual traits, because to me, you do make selection decisions on some of the visual traits. But how do you collect data, and how do you analyze that data, and how do you make those selection decisions using that? And we can, some of it is on farm, anyone can do, but we also want to talk a little bit about EPDs and how they work as well. Because ultimately, to make much genetic improvement as an industry, as a breed, we actually need to embrace these higher levels of genetic improvement. But on our farm, we can also do a lot. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do next week and talk and show you how to calculate one of the most basic things that every farm should do. And again, I'm going to show my bias, I guess, a little bit towards meat production. But from a meat production standpoint, meat goats and meat sheep is calculating adjusted weaning weights. How do you do that? How do you compare this lamb to this lamb? If you want to select for parasite resistance, how do you compare this lamb to this lamb, or this goat to this goat? The people that are dairy producers are lucky. I'm not saying you're in DHIA, but you could be in DHIA.